Hello everyone, my name is Fang Yi. I'm the educational technologist working at the Robertson Media Center, Clemens Library. In this asynchronous workshop, I will basically teach you how to create a podcast and also introduce you some of the free resources available at both the Robertson Media Center and online that you can access anytime. You will have access to these workshop slides. And the first thing I want to talk to you about is when you need help, especially with Audacity related. I recommend checking out Audacity menu. It basically covers all topics of the features of Audacity. And then also there's a good Audacity FAQs that you can use search function to find to use keywords and then search for some of the problems that you encountered. I recommend using these or some other online forums when you run into a issue, because often you will find other people run into similar issues, and then just with a quick search you can find your answers in 5 minutes. However, if you want to talk to someone about your problem or you just can't find an answer for it, I'm always available. So feel free to contact me anytime, and here's my email contact. Next, I want to talk to you briefly about the Robertson Media Center. If you haven't visited us before, we're located on the 3rd floor of Clemens Library. And we have introduction slides included here that basically show you all the different resources available at the Robertson Media Center. We have a lot of cool technologies, not limited to video audio productions, things like 3D printing, virtual reality. So definitely recommend you checking out our services and equipment. They're all free for UVA students and faculty. And then here you can also find our RMC website, which will link you to our website, and then you can also check out our equipment and spaces here. And we also have upcoming events usually published here. And then also another good resource for you is LinkedIn Learning, which you have a free access to while you're UVA students. This basically has a whole library of different things that you can learn about. So another thing I recommend you checking it out to learn almost any topics or software that you're interested. So here's the FAQ, and this is our contact information. Feel free to email us anytime or just come to the front desk. We always have consultants available to help you and answer your questions. Okay, now let's move on to talk about the media production process for creating a podcast. And usually we separate any media production into 3 stages: the pre-production stage, production stage, and the post-production stage. So for the pre-production stage, this is where planning happens. This is when you want to decide on what is my podcast format, and also draft out outline or script for your podcast so you can use that to record later. To determine your podcast formats, here I include very helpful resource that talks about the different types of podcast formats. You can see that there are 8 of them. So a lot of new podcast formats coming out because this has been so popular now these days. But the 3 ones that I think you need to pay attention to is the interview podcast format, basically you interview someone, or the solo or monologue podcast format. This is where you prepare speech and integrate maybe some of the media clips from outside. And then finally, this conversational ones is also quite popular. Usually there are 2 or 3 hosts that are having a conversation about a topic. And so these are the 3 major ones I want you to check out and see their pros and cons. And then you can decide on what podcast format you want to choose. And then think about the structure of your podcast. So once you determine your format, you want to write out a script or outline for your podcast. just the same as you writing a traditional paper. You don't just jump right in and start writing, right? You think about a general outline and what you want to talk about, and then it's similar for a podcast. And here you can see that no matter what kind of format you choose, this basically holds truth for all podcast formats. For commercial ones, you may have a sponsor message, but for our project, we don't need that. And then we'll have an introduction talking about, especially to the new audiences, what this podcast is about. And then you have some sound effects and music as an introduction. And then later you can have a longer explanation of what's going to be covered in this episode. And then you can divide your main, part of your podcast into a few topics. Under each of the topic, you want to have a main point and some supporting arguments, data, or quotes. This is just similar as you writing paper that you have general arguments and some supporting evidence, right? And here, when it comes to supporting quotes and the data, it's always good to think about what are some other media that I incorporate. So this is not the same as writing paper that you can only use, text. Here is, this is for listening. So you want to think about some other media that you can incorporate that may sound better than you reinterpret or re-summarize all of these things. So for example, you can think about some interview clips or some other recordings you've done with people. All of these will make your arguments more interesting if you integrate some other media clips. And then between each of the topic, you want to have segues. This is just a special term for podcasting. Basically, this is just transitions, right? You want to transition nicely from one topic to another so it doesn't feel abrupt. And after you finish your main topics, and then you have another segue to let people know that you're finishing up. So you will have a closing speech, and usually that's like a summary of what you covered in this episode. Because, if it's a longer episode, like a 45-minute, people will forget what they have learned. And then you do a nice quick summary will help people review the main points that you covered. And then you can also lead to a call to action if, you want to inspire people to do certain things. And then include sponsor message if this is commercial, and some sound effects and musicals to wrap up your podcast. So that's it. This is the basic outline. And here are some of the tips when writing your scripts. I will not go into details of all of these, but one thing to keep in mind is you're now writing for listening, not writing for reading. And there's a big difference here. That's why you want to keep your script conversational so it feels relaxed to listen to, and not like a dry speech that you prepare to read to your audience. Next thing, I also include, this is basically the same thing, outline templates that you can download, and then some additional resources when planning your script. And let's move on to production phase. And the production is all about recording, especially whether you're doing interviews or voiceovers, you want to get your recordings done at the production stage. And here, what I want to highlight is a lot of people are having a hard time, identifying some of the recording problems because their ears haven't been trained to look for those problems. Just like you have been trained for identifying your problems in your traditional essays, this is something that you have to practice. That's why I included some short practices from NPR, and they have provided these little examples of the different kinds of recording problems. They also provide some nice tips for avoiding these problems. So I wanted you to listen to each of them and then try to close your eyes and listen to them and see if you can identify these problems and try to avoid these while you do your own recording. But in general, here are some recording tips I provided. You want to wear your headphones if possible. This will help you monitor what you're recording. Basically, if you notice any like background noise while you're recording, then you can stop immediately. If you're not monitoring it with a headphone, then what happens is you can make a 15 long recording and then later find out there's just so much noise and you can't use it at all, and you just waste another 15 minutes. So you want to monitor if possible, and then you want to always try to find a room that is quiet, right, away from any background noise like air conditioning, buzzy lights, and humming refrigerators. I also recommend finding a smaller room because that will avoid having those echoing sounds in your recording. And in smaller rooms, they're generally the voice can bounce around, and you can also stuff yourself with some soft things like blankets, pillows to make the recording also sound nicer. And another tip is just record with external mics because our built-in microphones aren't that great, and also you can't get too close to the mics. And the key to get nice quality of sound is you want to get close to the mics. That's why I highly recommend checking out our desktop mics and pop filters available at the RMC. Just double check with our front decks. They're not available during the pandemic, but we will start to circulate them this fall. And the cell phone mics are also good, better than the built-in mic. And there are also a ton of apps you can use to do the recording. On iPhones, you can use voice memos. There's also another great free app works across platforms called Anchor, Anchor, and I highly recommend checking it out. It's also free. And another thing when working with the mic is making sure you are at a proper distance. So you want to stay close to your mic, but also not too close that you start to have those plosive sound. So just adjust your mics to make sure it's the proper position for you. And then finally, you want to try to speak slowly and always remember that you can make mistakes while you do the recording. No need to, stop when you make a mistake. When you make a mistake, and then you just pause and then start at the beginning of your sentence. And then when we're at the post-production stage, you can always edit out those mistakes. So that will save you time. Finally, here I have some voice training videos I've prepared here that just basically some tips for training your voice, because one thing is how good your script is. Another thing is how you are, reading those scripts or how you are talking to your listeners. So having a great voice, establish a connection with your audiences are important. However, it's not easy. It takes some trainings. So I recommend checking this video and learn more about some tips that you can practice. And finally, the post-production stage is where you put everything together and make them into a story, right? And then audio storytelling is really powerful, and using some sound effects, ambient noise, background music, you can recreate a world that doesn't exist. For example, you may record something in your room and then later adding some sound effects and making it sound like you recorded in a restaurant. So that's the power of editing. However, I also want to caution you, because it's very powerful, you can too easily manipulate truth and facts. Sometimes in an unextended fashion. For example, you may accidentally edit out certain parts of an interview, and that can totally change the original meaning of that sentence. So be aware of how the editing can manipulate truth and facts, and also be a responsible and ethical editor. And then during your editing process, you want to consider all the different sound elements that you can take advantage of and incorporate them into your podcast to make it richer and more immersive and more interesting for your audiences. Some of the elements I put here are, voiceovers, interview clips, some other media clips, music, sound effects. You want to think about how you can take advantage of all of these and then using the editing power to make them into a coherent piece. So here I provide a general editing process. So if you're new to editing, you may not know how to start, right? So the first thing you want to do is to review your outline script story. Just remind yourself what is the story you want to tell, what this podcast is about. And then you want to import your assets and start to sequence them and organize them into the right order. And you want to set up your tracks into what I recommend, usually a 4-track structure. You have your own, like a host audio, that could be your voiceover. And then second is actualities. Usually that means like interviews, guest audio. And next you want to have a track dedicated for sound effects. And then finally, you have your music. So those are the 4 essential tracks. And then you want to do some rough edits, basically sequence your clips, edit out some mistakes, and then adjust some of the volumes. And then finally, you want to mixing things together. That means you want to add fade-ins to make the transitions better. And then you want to fine-tune some of the details. And mixing is just to make sure that everything stays consistent and balanced. So you don't suddenly have a very loud background music and then very low like a voiceover. So you want to make sure that the volume stays consistent. And then you're not finished. It's an iterative process. And just like you're writing a paper, you want to, go back to it and do more edits and until you're pleased. So that's the editing process. And I provide another resource where, especially if you're using a lot of pre-recorded audio or some other media clips, learn how to transition smoothly to them is a key. So I have an article that provides some tips you can check out. Next, what I want you to do is to practice, editing techniques, because it's one thing to, watch all the tutorials. But until you start to really working with the software, you will start to realize, I don't know how to do this or that. So I prepared this creative challenge. Later you will see there's a video walkthrough. So I will not talk about how to do this here, but the video walkthrough, you want to watch it and learn how to complete this creative challenge to practice the skills and prepare yourself for your final project. And I include another session called hosting and creating websites for podcasts. This is for people who want to go above and beyond and want to create podcast website to host your trailers or episode. So the first thing I introduce here is Buzzsprout. Buzzsprout is a podcast hosting website and it's free under certain limit. So your project should qualify for the free plan. So I have a video tutorial show you how to do that. This is not like a standalone website. This is more like give you a very simple page where you can display some key information about your podcast, but also host your podcast on the website so everybody can access to it. But if you want to have a fancier podcast website, here I have another tutorial that I created to show you how to create a podcast website with Wix. This will allow you to make more customizable website with all lots of fancy features that you can learn to create. And here are some other additional resources about creating a website as well. And finally, I have a section called additional resources, and it included a lot of the free libraries for sound effects, music, and archival sound. And a lot of people find that archival.org is a great place for finding some of the news or audio recordings, interviews. So I highly recommend checking this out. And also there's some free music that you can use for your project. And another thing you always want to be aware of is the copyright, is whether you have rights to use their the media assets you find online, right? So I would recommend learning more about, understand the basics of copyright. But usually for student project, it's okay to use most of the media under, fair use for educational purposes. However, you might be limited on where you can publish these. So if these stays in the class, usually you're fine. But if you want to publish online and for other people to listen to or use as part of your portfolio, then you need to be really clear. And also, a lot of time you want to have proper citations of the assets that you used. So make sure that you understand the copyright issues. And then here is more information about how to use desktop microphones. That we have this exact one called the Yeti microphone. Is the same that I'm using for recording this tutorial. And then finally, we have LinkedIn Learning that I already talked about, that you should definitely check it out. And there's more tutorials on Audacity. So if you want to learn more and dive into the topic of podcasting, I recommend checking out LinkedIn Learning. Okay, so this is the end of the asynchronous workshop on podcasting. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me anytime. And good luck with your project.